That's all right.
See,
I'll tell you what. I'll give you Vermont and Connecticut if you'll give me
Don't
better.
do it.
Oh,
Don't
you
do
give
it.
me hell.
No,
I'm
I-
gonna hold on to
Don't
this
give it to
until
me.
you
I'll give you a
die.
better deal. I'll give you a better deal. Lots better. Here.
Oh, yeah, you got a better deal? What?
Yeah, I'll trade. Let me see.
All you
I'll
do
trade.
is talk. Would you pour a drink and let me go? All right? Would you do that for me, please?
For more than 3 decades, Americans have played a board and dice game dealing with the buying, selling, and leasing of properties and the creation of monopolistic blocks of housing. Each player's object, to squeeze his opponents dry financially, could be accomplished by raising the rent on his property so that each move by an opponent could be a potentially disastrous one.
It's your turn. Go ahead. Right.
Community chest, community chest.
Today in Baltimore and other large cities, the game of economic disaster via housing is played not on a board or with dice, but with real bricks, mortar, and people. And the loser may get stuck with something like this.
I got a free parking. Yay, $500. I counted it before.
No.
It is not. No one owns
Nobody
free parking. I got
Hey,
it.
by the way, I passed go 2 times.
Most poignant is the fact that the for real game of housing has so many losers. So many that it might be called the cruelest game in town. This is George Rogers. Housing, the cruelest game in town. Why cruel? Well, for one thing, because it affects so many people. Because so many people have to play, whether they want to or not. Tenant, landlord, city planner, taxpayer, all are caught in the economic vice of Baltimore's deteriorating housing market. The game is cruel, too, because there's little time to correct the situation. According to a soon-to-be-published report on Baltimore's housing dilemma, which is entitled The Grigsby Report, time is not on the city's side. One fact should be kept in mind, this report states, the deterioration of the housing inventory. The city cannot presume that conditions will, at worst, remain stable while it formulates long-term policies. Regardless of the larger housing objectives for Baltimore, the immediate problem cannot be ignored, or it will become too large to cope with. What is the problem? And who's affected? And what can be done? On the surface, Baltimore appears to be just another large, decaying eastern city, experiencing the problems that accompany such things as population decline, outmigration of industry and commerce, expanding black minority, the rise in social problems, and antagonism from suburban neighbors. With its predominance of row houses, Baltimore has been referred to as a smaller version of Philadelphia. But perhaps with its smaller population, Baltimore is considerably prettier than its northern neighbor, a pleasantness that is heightened by the fact that the urban fringe is still fairly close to the downtown area. Unfortunately, much of Baltimore is like this, and more is becoming this way every day. According to latest estimates, 20% of the city's population is ill-housed in some 65,000 substandard dwellings. The cancer of decay has produced more than 6,000 vacant houses, grim reminders of the row houses that at one time must have been charming, of condemned stores that not long ago were bustling. To the outsider, these boarded and bricked up homes indicate either the first step in a master plan or the diseased organs of a dying city. To the resident of the inner city, however, there is no either or. To the resident who lives within the system that perpetuates and expands the abandoned house, the substandard house, the signs indicate failure. It means he is the final heir to housing that fewer and fewer people want. He accepts because there are no other options left to him. A typical example of the person without options is Mrs. Eunice Ridley, who lives on Mulberry Street with her 4 children. In days past, there were 7 youngsters, but 3 have grown up now and are in the armed forces. Mrs. Ridley is not particularly unhappy with the 3-story, 5-room structure, partly because the rent is cheap at $54 a month. She does admit, however, that there are things that might be improved. Her backyard, for example, has virtually no green space. Bricked over or filled in with concrete years ago, what passes for a backyard is little more than the open area between crumbling walls of other buildings. Several of these have been abandoned or boarded up and are the property of Baltimore City. While these buildings await their ultimate fate, however, they and the neighbors around them are at the mercy of youthful vandals and not so youthful drug addicts. Inside Mrs. Ridley's home are 3 bedrooms. The largest of these, on the 3rd floor, is the most expansive room in the entire house, measuring approximately 12 feet by 12 feet. On the 2nd floor, there are 2 additional bedrooms, each approximately 10 by 10 feet square. And between these 2 bedrooms and the narrow hallways, the house's single bath, a triangular-shaped room just barely large enough for a tub, a toilet, and a wash bowl. On the 1st floor are our kitchen and living room. Because the structure was built before the advent of central heating, Mrs. Ridley relies on a space heater for warmth during the winter months. And these devices, if unvented, often give off carbon dioxide. Despite these inconveniences, Mrs. Ridley has grown accustomed to her 100-year-old home. Her daughter, Mrs. Irena Murdoch, however, has no affection for the house where she spent much of her girlhood.
I left this place in '64, and I have no intentions of coming back, because now it's gotten to the point a young child is not safe. Nobody is safe at all. A grown person, an old person cannot even walk the street. Once upon a time it was nighttime, but now it's just as bad in the daytime. Things that occur at night happen in the day. You're getting mugged, the older women, the children, even younger people are being attacked. And it's because of the community. If the community wasn't this way, I think a lot of things wouldn't happen. And we have the houses now. So many people have moved out, and they boarded them up. Children knock the doors down. Or whosoever want to go in the house, they'll take the boards down. And you can find as much activity in a boarded up house as you would in one that's occupied. And it's just not safe. A child has to come out his door and play on the street that's no more than 2 feet away from the cars. And it's not safe for him or her. If he wants to play someplace else, there's an old lot. It's full of glass, and it's not safe. So they could be easily hurt there. And as I said, you can walk on these lots at any time. And you might see someone there using drugs. And it's not safe for our children to be exposed to such a thing. And then as far as the houses are concerned, the space heater, the particular house that my mother lives in, she had a very serious asthma condition from this house because of the space heater. Whenever she would turn the space heater on, it wouldn't bring on the sort of heat that she needed. And it was sky high. It cost so much to burn the space heaters. And she would have so many asthma attacks that she got to the point she had to rely on her oven or her gas stove for heat. because she would get so sick from inhaling the fumes from the gas stove. And the house is rat-fested.
Who is to blame for the fact that so many persons live in homes such as this? Society as a whole, of course, perpetuates the trap, but does any particular segment shoulder more than its share of responsibility? Some say no. Others feel that the most obvious villain is the absentee landlord.
When I left my mother in '64, I moved up to Carlton Avenue. And the rent was $12 a week. And I had bedroom and kitchen. And that landlord, he didn't care what happened as far as his tenants were concerned. All he cared about was getting his $12 a week. Now at my kitchen there was a fire escape. And this was the only means I had of getting air in the summertime. And you could see people walking up and down the fire escape just like it was a public stairway. And down at the bottom of the staircase, drunks, anything. You'll see anything down there. And I didn't want my children exposed to this. And he's the worst landlord I've ever had. As a matter of fact, I was pregnant during the time, and I went to the hospital to have my baby. And when I came home from the hospital with my baby, the landlord had set my things out. He had not given me any kind of notes whatsoever, and I only owed him 2 weeks' rent. So I moved back down with my mother.
See, the landlord, some of them will fix the house when the people are first moving in. And after that, then, if you don't keep it up your own self, the house is in a terrible condition. But they're there every week for their rent.
It is true that more than 60% of Baltimore's rental inventory is held by small investor owners who live in other neighborhoods. And it is equally true that the absentee landlord or landlady coming to collect the rent is one of the most maligned figures in the world. In fact, one might say that the adverse commentary has grown so strong against the landlord that he or she has developed a kind of neurosis about the profession.
Through the news media, I would say for the past many years now, I think an absentee landlord or an absentee owner of property, also known as a landlord, has lost his dignity. If I had to guess what I would like to have returned to me today as being, as far as being an absentee landlord or an absentee owner of property, is my dignity.
I don't feel that we have to be defensive. I think that we do a job in this city, managing and operating low-income housing, and I feel that it's just that by the constant pressure of the press and publicity that's received from all sides, which puts us in a defensive position. I personally am not defensive about our business at all.
As an industry, we provide services and housing that the government and other sectors of the private community cannot give at anywhere near the cost and efficiency that we as private landlords can offer the community. One of the very big problems that we face is the lack of objectivity by the total community, and I hope that full disclosure to the community of the problems, the costs involved, will enlighten many people in the community to help make a better Baltimore.
Just who is the absentee landlord and how responsible is he or she for the deterioration of Baltimore's housing? Mrs. Molly K. Whitto is an example of what the Grigsby report calls a medium-sized investor. That is, those holding from 24 to 100 units. All told, medium-sized investors control some 15% of the total rented inventory of the city. But most, like Mrs. Whitto, feel it is a losing proposition.
Well, these houses don't make a lot of money. It seems on the surface that they should, and yet we were amazed when we went to the accountant for our income tax and found out exactly where we stood. This is the first year that we've been on our own with them since the death of my mother and our complete inheritance, and the accountant was just appalled. Our income for the year was in the nature of almost $24,000, no, $23,500 gross. And out of that, our expenses were $23,700, which meant a total loss of $280, if you can believe it. And it's only the depreciation on these properties which kept them from being more of a total loss than they are. Now, how long can we keep on going like this?
Just how much profit does the oft maligned absentee landlord make during an average year? As an example, the median contract rent in the city is approximately $76 a month, or $912 per year. This amount, or as much of it as is actually collected, must pay all fixed and operating expenses, including management and debt, before any income can be credited as a return on equity capital. According to the Grigsby report, however, 14% of these homes are vacant from 1 to 6 months. Thus, combining vacancies and uncollected rents, the landlord's margin of profit per unit slips to $792. Real estate taxes, ground rents, liability insurance, fire insurance, when it's available, reduce the figure by another $265 to $527. Maintenance, repair, water and sewer charges reduce the profit to $197. And management fees bring the profit figure to $118 per unit, perilously close to the break-even point. Thus, the medium-sized landlord often finds himself playing it close to the vest. A rise in city taxes, not an uncommon occurrence, can make or break him. Still, another common occurrence can turn his game of housing into a horror. This is the problem created by vandals, who, by setting fire to a nearby house, may succeed in putting even the most conscientious landlord out of business. Just such an incident took place in the 1000 block of West Lombard Street, where most of Mrs. Whittow's properties are located. One Sunday night in June of 1971, fire broke out in 1029, a building which had been vacated and boarded up previously. The fire spread to 1031, a structure rented from Mrs. Whittow by Mrs. Ellen Bogus. Fortunately, Mrs. Bogus was able to evacuate the building in time, but for the landlady, 1031 became a burden rather than a bonus from that moment on. Not only did the fire endanger Mrs. Bogus's family, but it also spread to number 1033, the home of Mrs. Mary Karcher, a longtime renter who is now thinking about moving.
The lady next door, she had to evacuate her home because of the roof. Her place was on fire. It started to come over to my third floor. The firemen had to tear the ceiling out of my third floor front and back room. These teenagers from 13, 15, 17 years old, they stay back there. They fool around the grounds in the back of the empty houses. They go in there and sniff glue. We've had trouble with that. During the day, they would do the very same thing. It was last year. I used to call the police. The police would come. Well, I'd watch the front. The woman next door would watch the back. The children wouldn't come out. The police would go from the third floor to the basement. They wouldn't find nobody. We have trapdoors in our houses, you know, on the attic. They used to get out the trap door and lay on top of the roof. That's why the police didn't find them. I've been up for the past 2 years. I sleep down, 2.5 years. I stay downstairs all night long. Because I sleep 15 or 20 minutes at a time. I get up, I walk from front to the back. If there's anything out the back, I'll go out back and check. So you can't have your clothes hanging after they come. They steal anything from you. I'm scared. And they had one at 1027 about 2 years ago, which affected the 1029. Well, the man there died, his wife deceased, and he deceased. That house has been vacant for about 2 years now. And then it happened to that house. The woman 1031 had to leave her home, had to evacuate her home because of the fire. I'll be next.
One way for the landlord to protect his vacant houses from vandals is illustrated by this somewhat drastic measure. But lining a building with solid concrete every time it is vacated could become an expensive proposition. Likewise, there are few ways for the average landlord to protect himself from tenants who do not seem to care about others' property, who dump garbage and refuse indiscriminately around the grounds, or who move away in the middle of the night in order to avoid payment of rent.
Of course, you know, you hear everybody say if you get rid of the bad landlords, you've solved the city's housing problem. Well, that's a complete fallacy. We've got some very good property owners in the city of Baltimore. They're professionals in their field. In a review CPHA did recently, the top 3 property owners in the city of Baltimore, not one of them was brought to housing court. Anytime there was a violation in their properties, it was corrected immediately. you do have 12 to 15 what you would call bad landlords in this city, and you know, they're really bad. The attention has got to be focused on more than just the landlords, because it's not just bad landlords. We're also talking about something called bad tenants. And you know, all of us liberals have thought for the past few years that, oh, you know, the tenants are the greatest things going. A number of them are. But we've got to also recognize now the situation has reached such crisis proportions that we've got to recognize that there are also bad tenants. There are people who are not culturally inclined toward housekeeping, towards keeping a property up. And when you sit down and you begin talking to property owners across the city of Baltimore, people who are trying to make a contribution to the city, you know, they'll put $1,000 into a piece of property, they'll walk by it 2 days later and it's completely destroyed. Now that's just as wrong. A bad tenant is just as bad as a bad landlord as far as we're concerned. And we've got to begin to recognize that fact.
Since the first urban renewal area in Harlem Park was instituted, I have been talking about tenant responsibility. This is where a tenant would be held responsible for the acts which he commits within a house. No landlord that I know of breaks his own windows. There's no landlord I know kicks his own plaster out. There's no landlord tears his own doors off the hinges or dumps his garbage in the yard. These are the problems which beset us every day. And I have suggested to HCD many times, and so has our organization, that the tenant be held responsible and be served notices at the same time that we are served notices. In fact, I have advocated that there be either a social worker or a specially trained inspector to go through each urban renewal area to be sure that people receive the training that is necessary to maintain the properties which we repair for them. This is an urgent need, and unless it is met, the same pattern of tear down, build up, tear down, and build up will be repeated in every neighborhood in the city. There are many people who arrive in the city without the training necessary to live an urban life.
I think it's a social problem. I think until people learn how to live in houses, how to take care of them, even if they don't own them, we're going to be faced with this more and more. As a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, the city, who's the biggest landlord of all, had a school for some years to teach people how to teach people who lived in their low-cost income housing how to live in houses or in apartments, whatever it was. And they couldn't continue it because they didn't have the funds, but they actually felt the need to have such a thing. Now, how can we, as tiny little landlords, compete with such a thing? We can't have a school of our own, but we know that something is needed to keep these people from gouging out plaster, from making the plumbing come apart, and everything that has water has to be fixed in some of these houses 3 and 4 times a year. Now, do we go down there and do this, or do they do it themselves?
Mrs. Murdoch, we hear much from landlords about bad tenants. Do you believe that there's such a thing as a bad tenant?
Yes, I definitely feel as though there's such a thing as bad tenants, because lots of times when a family moves into a house and it's decent and what they want as far as living conditions are concerned, and they don't care about it, they tear it down, and not keeping it clean also brings on a bad thing, because the landlord doesn't want to take care of a house that the tenant is not taking care of. And sometimes you get a bad landlord from a bad tenant.
Although as a general rule, old housing is more susceptible to deterioration than new, it is by no means automatic that a neighborhood of 60, 70, or even 80-year-old homes should fall into disrepair. This, for example, is a section of East Baltimore that is near spotless in its condition. Yet the homes are not much younger than those of Lombard Street or other sections of the city now faced with a crisis of decay. The house itself is a fairly standard Baltimore institution built before or around the turn of the century, the masonry row house with white marble steps. Except for the style, however, one would have no idea that the homes are as old as they actually are. And although there is a high incidence of home ownership in this particular neighborhood, many people do rent, and it's nearly impossible to distinguish the homes that are being rented from those that are being occupied by the owners. Only a few blocks away, however, the situation begins to change. In substantially the same kind of neighborhood, in substantially the same type of home, the first signs of decay are visible. There is, for example, the house struck by fire, which now sits vacant, a target for vandals, a source of depression for neighbors who care about what kind of surroundings they live in. And once a neighborhood starts to deteriorate, the process is difficult to stop. Not caring then shows itself in 100 different ways, from failure to maintain the home to trash in the alley. Another short distance away, substantially the same type of housing has gone nearly all the way down. Thus, the housing game can be disastrous for many small and medium-sized landlords who do not have the time or means of absorbing many attacks of vandalism or the neglect of inconsiderate tenants. Paradoxically, the large investors, those holding 100 or more units, are much better able to withstand the occasional setback by using methods that are not generally available to the small operator.
25% of our time is devoted to tenant selection. We consider it part of a four-part process in our business. We're able to survive because we can plan, we have enough capital resources available, our borrowing power, our planning, our management is capable. The four parts can be divided into acquiring the property as 1, financing the property as 2, 3, preparing the property for occupancy. After we go through these 3 steps, we feel that unless we go through the 4th step, which consumes at least 25% of our time, screening the tenant. We want somebody that will take care of the property and keep it at least in as good a condition as we give it to them. We don't expect any of our tenants to necessarily improve our property. We just want to get that property back at the end of 2, 3, 4 years in the same condition as we give it to them. I have here a list of people that applied for an apartment in Govans. These were all rejections, and these were after the people had been qualified over the phone. We must have had 50 applicants for this apartment, and we feel that we selected the best tenant that we could get for the area, because bear in mind, we are community conscious. We don't want to put anybody into an apartment or a house that would not blend in with the area in terms of size of family, income capabilities, past performance in another area. We would not want to take somebody, for example, with 5 or 6 children for a 3-room apartment where the neighbors in the community would be all up in arms. We like to project that possibly we're going to live next door to those same people. Now, would we want to do it ourselves? Our answer is no. We have to select, and that fully takes up a lot of our time. And this is where the part-time operator, the small owner, has his problems. He can't go out. He doesn't have the time to select the tenant. He doesn't have the know-how to run a credit report, check an employment verification, check a past history of occupancy. This is all time consuming, and without it, the battle can be lost.
We figured out that for the amount of work that I put in to these houses, not only down there, but all the paperwork and all the bookwork, I must be getting about 34 cents an hour. Now, who else is going to work for money like that? We feel like we're at the mercy of the city authorities. We're also at the mercy of our tenants, and we're in an inextricable position, and we don't know which way to turn. What would you do if you were in our shoes? We would unload them, but we're not at the point where we're ready to give them away, because we still have this service attitude in mind. Who's going to take over to do what we're doing now? Is the city going to do that? Is that why all these abandoned houses are around all boarded up? We're not the only ones in this position, and we're trying to hold out, but after this year we may find ourselves just in that position. Where are all these people going to live? What's the city going to do? Is it going to be a municipally operated inner city group? We'll be as interested to see as all the other people who are involved.
But neither profit-seeking landlord nor inconsiderate tenant creates conditions such as this great open plain between Mulberry and Franklin Streets. In many cases, it is charged that the city or federal government has been its own worst enemy by spreading confusion and despair in the minds of both landlord and tenant who own or live in property close to public works projects. This section, for example, near the Washington Boulevard, used to be a bustling commercial area. It now resembles a ghost town, a series of boarded-up reminders of the recent past. But economic disaster and decay struck here prematurely and over too wide an area as a result of governmental delay in deciding upon and disseminating definite plans for a new highway. Amid the protracted confusion, landlords refused to make repairs on homes. Tenants moved out before it was actually necessary. As a result, important services have been denied to those who remain behind, according to William P. Gantz, a worker with the Community Action Agency.
While they were making the decisions, the hearings, and all the plans, that is the engineering plans for the road, some 300 to 400 houses in the area in which I work have been under this threat, and of course have been either bought by the city or have sort of rotted away. Because of the threat of the incoming expressway, most of the residents here are now lacking in most of the services that the other parts of the city are accustomed to on a daily basis. For instance, they had a library on the 900 block of West Barry Street 8 years ago due to lack of use because people were moving out because of the road. And because of the threat of the road itself, they moved the library up to Hollins and Calhoun Street. Now that library has now moved to Hollins and Payson Street, which means that the nearest library is the Central Library or the one over in South Baltimore, which is about 2.5 miles away, where most of the residents here had a library within walking distance of about a 5 or 6 block radius. In addition to that, due to the threat of the expressway, the Reed's Drugstore on the 800 block of Washington Boulevard was taken out. The nearest prescription or drug that a person can get is up on Howard Street and or over at the Cross Street, near the Cross Street Market. There is a drugstore there. A local person who does do a little bit of drug prescription raises prices 20 to 25% when Reed's left. The Columbia movie and the other movie on Fremont Avenue have both closed down due to the threat of the expressway, and no movie has come in. So you can see how the services in the South Baltimore area have dwindled down to nothing. After the road is built, maybe the services will come back in 8 or 10 years, but these people have been for the last 2 years, and it looks like maybe 2 or 3 more before anything constructive can be put down. We'll be without these services that are normal across the city.
Throughout this area, the no trespassing, property of City of Baltimore signs are constant reminders that the biggest single landlord in Baltimore is the city itself. The city is also a dominant factor in determining the overall quality of housing in the metropolitan area by formulating plans and policy. The nerve center for this planning is the Department of Housing and Community Development, headed by Commissioner Robert C. Embry. Officials at HCD seem to be well aware of the fact that too much government can be as damaging to housing progress as either bad landlords or bad tenants.
True that the expressway system has caused a great deal of damage to the housing stock in the city. In part, this damage has been caused because the city has been responsive to neighborhood requests and citizen requests that the road be moved from one location to another and that the road be diminished in its size. But there's no getting away from the fact that the expressway, aside from arguable positive benefits that it will have, has caused a great deal of harm to many of the residential neighborhoods in Baltimore.
Through the Department of Housing and Community Development, the housing game can also be rough on landlords by subjecting them to inspections for possible violation of the building and sanitary codes of the city. Suffice it to say, the calling of the inspector is not usually received with delight. The purpose of housing inspections, of course, is to uncover and eliminate serious health and or physical safety violations. But many landlords, especially those in tenuous economic circumstances, claim that inspectors often indulge in area-wide blitzes or even in random inspections during which so-called laundry lists of violations are compiled, where serious structural, plumbing, wiring, and other similar violations are mixed with less serious cosmetic or decorative ones. Such lengthy violation notices, according to some landlords, leave them little discretion in handling maintenance funds and ignore the stark fact that much of the inner city rental inventory is well over 50 years old. Yet, if all elements of a violation notice are not complied with, the notice is not withdrawn and the landlord is subject to criminal penalties. In addition, landlords point out that since turnover among inspectors is great and there is an insufficient number of them to cover the stock, often different inspectors will re-inspect their properties after repairs have been made. More than likely, they add, the re-inspection will result in additional citations because the new inspector examines different things than his predecessor, or because it took so long for the re-inspection to be made that certain tenant-caused violations had been repeated. Although many landlord complaints can be dismissed as routine discontent with the system, according to the Grigsby report, there is reason to believe, quote, that the existing system places the landlord at the mercy of a fairly transient staff of inspection personnel, many of whom are not highly trained, and some of whom are openly antagonistic to them, end of quote. As one example of the dangers of over-inspection, Mrs. Whitto cites the case of her unnecessary fire escape.
A woman who did not like how I talked to her at 2:30 in the morning when she called me up about some subject or other, called the inspector, and she was very knowledgeable about all the things that were the matter, and we got a list of about 32 violations, most of which were minor, and we corrected. However, the fire escape was part of this, and we knew already what it was going to be, and we told the inspector that if we made a fire escape, the house would be a loss to us. But he said, lady, I'm doing my job. So, at the cost of several $100s, we made a beautiful fire escape from the second floor porch to the first, ruined a perfectly good backyard where people hung their clothes and let their children play occasionally. And within less than a week, the girl who was living there said, Miss Molly, I have got to move. I can't stay here. The vandals are coming and stealing things out of my house when I have to go out sometime. So we found her another place to live. We boarded up this second and third floor with tin and plyboard, and that's the way it's going to be from now on. This is one instance of how complying with the letter of the law leads to the actual halving of our income and possibly the entire ruin of the house. The house was up for, I don't know, 80 to 100 years the way it was, and we had people living there for as long as I can remember on the first and second floors, and now we may just possibly have to abandon that house altogether.
We are in effect the umpires in this situation, the arbiters of the condition. The housing code has certain requirements or certain regulations that have to be enforced. Some of them are the responsibility of the tenant. Others are the responsibility of the landlord. We visit the premises, make a determination of what the actual condition is, and issue the notice to whatever party is responsible for doing what they have to do.
The landlord at the present time finds himself in a difficult position inasmuch as they are making one inspection district after another. Gay Street isn't finished yet. Broadway East is being pushed to completion. They're now opening up Rosemont, Upton, Poppleton, and they're coming forth in so fast a sequence that those of us who may have 10 properties here, 20 properties there, 8 properties someplace else, with the notices coming out as close as they are, and with no money to borrow from the local institutions, people who are substantial in this business today could actually go broke.
Just how effective is code enforcement in improving housing conditions? According to the present rules of the housing game, violations of the various housing codes are criminal charges. But this has not stopped the activities of a hard core of perennial violators. Raymond Weinberg, for example, owns these homes. known also as Buddy Realty, Raymond Realty, and Weinberg Realty, his properties have a total of 425 unabated violations, for which he has received no fines. The properties of Herbert Kaufman have 883 charges of housing violations. Although Mr. Kaufman has received $1,675 in fines, less than 10% of the charges against him have actually been processed. Ben and Sam Callis, also known as Bell Vista Company and American Realty, have a total of 240 charges, for which they have received 4 fines totaling $100. Willis Wiggins properties have accumulated 109 charges of code violations. The court has found him guilty on 32 of these and levied fines totaling $405. Jeffrey Levitt, operating under the titles of Coleman Realty and Oak Hollow Realty, has received 187 charges, of which 110 have been postponed. The properties of James E. Soule, also the Bond Federal Savings and Loan Association, have accumulated 51 charges. 5 fines totaling $125 have been levied. Warren Shaw, operating under the titles of Utah Realty and Manning Shaw Realty, has 68 charges pending against his properties. No fines have been levied by the housing courts. But not all of Baltimore's housing violations are on properties owned by names that are relatively unfamiliar to the average citizen. In some cases, these properties are the investment holdings of prominent office holders or others in government positions. For example, this property at 904 North Fulton Avenue is owned by Clarence Mitchell, Maryland State Senator. Blaming vandalism and lack of funds for his inability to repair the property, Mr. Mitchell first requested a jury trial, then dropped it, causing the case to be returned to municipal housing courts. Thus do many violators of the inspection system play the game and escape the futile clutches of the housing courts. That court system, according to CPHA Director Christopher Hartman, is full of many, many such loopholes.
Of course, if the landlord wants to delay or evade the housing court, he's almost given carte blanche to do so in this state. Because the housing court is a criminal court, we use the old American constitutional prohibition that everything will be done before a man is given a criminal penalty. And these landlords are treated that way too. When a man is finally brought into housing court, the housing court is at the municipal level, and there are no provisions for jury trial. So if a landlord asks for a jury trial, his case is then sent up to the Supreme Bench. Well, if you think the people in housing court don't consider housing problems important and don't take any action to abate them, then you ought to see what happens at the Supreme Bench. Because at the Supreme Bench, the judges couldn't care less about bringing these cases to trial, for jury trials up there. They're just not important in their minds. They're interested in street crimes, in organized crime, and things like that. They're frankly not interested in housing violations. The prosecutor's office, the prosecutor couldn't care less about getting these things abated. They'd like to get this whole system off their backs. The court clerks, they couldn't care less. Here's one landlord, in the course of a year and a half, 404 charges he had brought up from housing court to the Supreme Bench. This is from January of '69 through June of 1971. 404 charges he brought up to the Supreme Bench of Baltimore City. He has been arraigned on 28 of those and prayed jury trials up there. This is another process you go through, another delaying process you go through. When he was arraigned on another 38, he said, oh, well, I'll take those back in housing court, so they get sent back and put at the end of the docket, and 8 months later, maybe the case will come up. On 338 of them, and this goes back 2 years, remember, he hasn't even been arraigned. And not one single trial, since he first sent his first case up in January of '69, has been tried. On all of our landlords that are carrying cases to the Supreme Bench, we have not had a single jury trial. The chief judge of the Supreme Bench, the state's attorney, they'll talk about bringing these cases to trial, but there's not enough time. They've got a big backlog up there, and there's no real commitment to erase these violations. As long as we permit this system to continue, where a man knows if he pays a jury trial, he's never going to be brought to trial, then we might as well forget about saving the housing in the inner city. And we might as well forget about giving some respect for the housing court and for the Supreme Bench when it comes to housing violations.
And thus we come full circle in the housing game. The tenant, suffering real and cruel ensnarement, often blames his landlord. The landlord, often suffering genuine economic woes, blames the city or his tenants. Others blame the ineptness of housing court. In desperation, still others cry that the entire rental system should be taken out of the private sector and turned over completely to some form of government. Otherwise, they say, the housing needs of the city's poor will never be taken care of, because only a kind and beneficent government will supply those needs without injecting the profit motive. This leaning toward federal or municipal assistance in housing is hardly new, especially here in Baltimore. More than 3 decades ago, this city was one of the very first to attack the problem of slums. In fact, public housing experts often call 1939 the year, for it was in that year that the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, armed with slogans such as "disease and low rent go together," issued a booklet publicizing the dangers of slum living. That booklet pointed out that 25,000 Baltimore homes were in substandard condition, that many people were living without hot and cold running water, without adequate heat, and without privacy. Using the United States Housing Act of 1937, which provided the legislation necessary to clean slums, Baltimore became one of the first cities in the nation to start cleaning its own house. In 1939, a 7 1/2 acre tract was selected as the site for the city's first public housing units. Bounded by Amity, Lexington, Fremont, and Saratoga streets, the area was the site of the Poe Homes, named, of course, in honor of the poet of Amity Street. Since 1939, public housing and urban renewal have grown by leaps and bounds in Baltimore. Often it seemed that the grand projects might never get off the drawing boards or the slick models ever come to life. But slowly and surely, urban renewal has become a way of life. In 1968, in the Housing and Urban Development Act, Congress reaffirmed its commitment to the goal of a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, first enunciated in the Housing Act of 1949. In Baltimore, after a fling at high-rise public housing, officials decided that smaller structures such as garden apartments or townhouses should be substituted for high-rises in housing low-income families. One major problem in the construction of public housing, however, is that of finding sufficient land. Baltimore proper has little vacant land on which to build, but suburban communities have vigorously resisted low-income housing to date. Until this problem is solved, urban renewal and public housing in Baltimore may be little more than a rear-guard action. Still another project initiated by the Department of Housing and Community Development is known as the Vacant House Program, which has as its aim the structural rehabilitation of homes which might otherwise have to be razed. If a particular neighborhood is considered worth salvaging, it may be included in the Vacant House Program. And under this program, HCD hopes to rehabilitate some 1,400 vacant homes. The Federal Housing Authority has already put up $20 million for the 3-year program, and about 200 completed homes have been occupied and another 700 contracted since the project was launched last spring. When a house is rehabilitated, the end result is a new house within the old frame, including walls, ceiling, plumbing, kitchen, etc. The cost per house, however, is high, between $12,000 and $16,000 per unit. Another major roadblock to the program is a shortage of contractors. This is developed because the buildings to be saved are spread out, are different sizes and shapes, have a high vandalism rate, and in general, the size of the job does not make it worthwhile for a large contractor. So far, it is probably too early to say whether the Vacant House Program is a success. Accordingly, critical opinion is divided.
You have 2 ways of looking at it. Is it good or bad? You have to say it's good in that the house is repaired, and I tend to give a priority to that in a neighborhood. When they go in and they'll take a house and they'll completely rehabilitate it, and it's no longer a vacant house, it's a functioning, good housing unit, and it's adding some character to the neighborhood, that's good. On the other side, the cost is just out of sight. But again, you know, we're using federal monies on this, and you can say you're wasting money, and you know and you'll have politicians standing up all the time in the Congress and say, we're wasting money on this, we're wasting money on that. But the unfortunate thing is federal dollars, that's what the word is. The word is waste. Who gets the mostest is what it means. So if Baltimore decides we're going to rehabilitate 1,500 vacant houses and we're going to get $15 million from the federal government to do this, sure, you'll find wastage in the program. Baltimore will eliminate 1,500 bad housing units, will save a number of neighborhoods through the program. There will be wastage, but what's the other side of it? What happens if Baltimore doesn't do this? Well, if Baltimore doesn't do it, Baltimore's got 1,500 vacant houses, which have a tendency to spread like a malaria around the neighborhood and create more vacant houses. We've done nothing to try to eliminate a problem. And where does the $15 million go with all its wastage, whatever it may be? It goes to Cleveland, or it goes to Detroit, or it goes to Los Angeles. And the people of Baltimore, for the federal tax dollars they're spending, are getting no return on their money. The people in Cleveland are getting a better return. It's a game you're playing with these federal dollars. Who gets the most return for his federal tax dollar?
Take the exploitation out of private real estate management and let the government do it. Many people have different feelings about this. We know from experience that the cost of management in the private sector and the efficiency is a lot faster, a lot cheaper than government housing. We think that most of the community would prefer to live in private housing with the hope of buying their own home and a more responsive management position. We know that the maintenance costs, for example, in public housing are practically double what they are in private housing. It's going to be up to the community by and large to decide whether they want more government assistance and how they want it. But just to say, take the exploitation out of real estate and let the government do it is a hoax. It's a hoax upon the poor people. It's a hoax upon the taxpayers.
Together with the current landlord-tenant dilemma, the growth of federal public housing seems to indicate that private investors can no longer flourish except in suburbia. There are, however, at least a few indications to the opposite. These apartments in Highlandtown, for example, now take the place of what used to be a row of garages. They were constructed with private funds and have been extremely successful, if a long waiting list is a true barometer of success. Those persons concerned with the future of private investment in the city might well ask then if such construction is a prelude to even greater involvement from the private sector.
Most of the properties which HCD is rehabilitating under their vacant house program, these properties are located in areas which absentee owners or professional landlords do not want to own properties. They're beyond, they've had a belly full, they just want to get out of these, so to speak, old areas. The absentee owner is looking on the horizon for new avenues, new areas to invest in. We consider most of the areas that HCD is rehabilitating the properties to be passé. I will say this, there are isolated cases where absentee owners would be willing to purchase some of the boarded up houses. It would only be in isolated cases, but at the same time we could put these properties back on the market at far less the cost of $15,000 to $18,000 per unit and still give people a decent place in which to live under our present housing codes of Baltimore City.
A major problem that exists that is not often recognized by people concerned with housing generally is that most housing is private housing. In the city, 290,000 dwelling units exist, and of that, about 12,000 are publicly built or publicly financed. The remainder, the 280,000 remainder, is private. If the private market doesn't work, housing doesn't work in the city. And the private market is not working in much inner-city housing. The return that an owner can receive by charging a fair rent is not high enough to meet his costs, his mortgage costs, taxes, water costs, his vandalism costs. And unless something is done to make this situation work, the landlord will continue to abandon these properties. And we can see the number of vacant houses increasing in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, every northern and eastern city. So something has to be done to change this. Now, what can be done? Well, one thing is to crack down on vandalism, the stripping of houses, which is becoming an epidemic in our cities. And family will move out, and the next day the house will be so vandalized that it requires $3,000 or $4,000 to fix it up, and it just isn't the owner's isn't worth his time to do so, even if he could get the financing. The second thing is that most problems are experienced by the small property owner who owns 5 or 10 properties, who doesn't have his own work crews, who doesn't have the financial backing to take a case of vandalism. It bankrupts him. who doesn't have the management experience and often inherited the properties or got them, has them as a second line of business. What might be done in this area is to create neighborhood-based management corporations, nonprofit corporations, that would have the expertise, that would have the volume, that could take over these houses and consolidate them in packages of 100, 200, 1,000, could get the benefits of scale, and could get these small owners out of the business and get people in that were sensitive to the inner city needs, and who the profits could go into neighborhood concerns, and the benefits of technical and professional experience could be gained, which is now absent in many cases.
And so the housing game continues in Baltimore and scores of other metropolitan areas. If it seems too casual to refer to the social and economic manipulation of people as a game, let us add that the stakes are indeed high. For unless each and every one of the players finds a measure of success, we shall all bear the consequences.
This is a Channel 2 editorial. The story we have told you during the past hour is tragically all too true. It is also continuing, and from where the city stands right now, could accelerate. The deterioration of housing in the inner city, which you have seen, has already cost us 10,000 dwellings within the past few years, and we lose others nearly every day. From the standpoint of tax revenues to the city, the lost dwellings cost Baltimore an estimated $2 million a year. From the standpoint of city expenditures for municipal services, the burden is commensurately increased. First lesson we learned from this study is that there is no single villain, no scapegoat in the housing picture. So we cannot point a finger and say, let him change, let him clean things up. Apropos here is that great line from Walt Kelly's Pogo, who sagely commented, "We have met the enemy, and they is us." So it is up to us to fashion a remedy. Housing Commissioner Robert Embry Jr. suggests a management collective to take over inner-city dwellings from landlords large and small, to repair, rent, and handle them with the cost efficiency of a housing supermarket. It is an idea well worth looking into. Some have suggested stricter but more efficient courts to enforce the codes, and it is hoped the new district courts, which took over the housing court functions, will help in this area. Still others point out that Baltimore once stood in the forefront of American cities in the percentage of its citizens owning their own homes, but that position has weakened badly. Of all the remedies suggested, individual home ownership seems to hold the most reasonable hope. It costs money to board up or tear down an abandoned house, and it then becomes a constant worry and a continuing loss. We suggest instead that ways be found to make it easier for families of deserving poor to acquire as their own property dwellings in which they can make permanent homes. That catastrophic sequence, vacant house, vandalized house, destroyed house, is all too common. It becomes a cancer threatening the existence of the city. Whichever of those brave men contesting for the mayoralty of Baltimore wins, he will have to face this problem the first morning of his first day in office. Whatever help he can get from all of us, he will need.
I'll give you $300 for Park Place, plus Kentucky and Tennessee, and then you'll have all the yellows.
Don't do it.
No, don't sell them.
Don't do
No.
it because you've got hotels on it, right?
But we got to work together.
Every time you go on there.
Look, if you stick with me, then we'll help.
I knew, but you have to.
Just go ahead and roll, Doug, because I can't wait any longer.
Deal with it.
Roll the dice until she decides what
Does
she's
she
going
get
to
free
do.
stoppage
Go to
every
jail,
time?
right, go to
She
jail.
can't, no, she can't go until I get here.
If she doesn't get free stoppage every time, she should.
You remember the last
If
time
you land-
you got the community chest, right?
If you land on free parking, did you get $500, though, and you're going to do it.
That's
You'll do it on your next roll. There's no worry about it.
I wouldn't do that.
Tennessee, Kentucky and Tennessee, right.
You can tell by looking at him, he's a slum landlord.
That's not
what
true.
he
Now,
is.
come on.
Oh,
I'll help
hey.
you if you'll help me.
Hey, I'm on boardwalk.
No, it's your turn.
If you're on board.